get it working. I have no idea what's wrong, but I think it's the headset. I might need to get a new one. But whatever.
This video was made using insights from vidIQ. Stick around after the video to find out how we used vidIQ as our secret YouTube weapon while making it. When you're invading an enemy nation, the last thing you want to be doing is building extensive defensive fortifications. If, like Russia, your army is forced to do this, then your invasion isn't quite going to plan. But despite erecting the most extensive network of trenches in Europe since World War I, Russia's strategy isn't likely to work. But first, what exactly is Russia doing? And how did it get here? Rocked on its heels by the ferocity of the Ukrainian counterattack at the end of the summer, Russian forces have found themselves in a perilous situation for any would-be invader. If there is one single weapon that Ukraine's counteroffensive hinged on, it was the HIMARS. If there were two, it would be the HIMARS and the High-Speed Anti-Radiation Missile, or HARM. A very close third would be the massive amounts of ammunition, artillery, and shells provided by the West. Before any offensive, there is a phase called shaping operations. During this phase, the attacker uses whatever resources it has available to shape the conflict to come. In World War I, this phase of an offensive would typically entail massive amounts of artillery, with barrages lasting as much as 2 weeks, all in an effort to significantly soften up enemy defenses. In World War II, shaping operations began to take on a more modern definition, involving the use of feints, intelligence deceptions, and covert action behind enemy lines. The goal is typically to mess up enemy plans, make them more difficult to implement, divert enemy forces away from your objective, and neutralize force multipliers, or things like terrain features or weapon systems that significantly increase the lethality of troops on the ground. HIMARS began shaping operations in mid-July with a blistering barrage of strikes against Russian lines of communication, command and control posts, and ammo dumps. The HIMARS mini-offensive caught the Russians completely by surprise, who to date had yet to face any sort of significant precision weapon threat in any conflict. Accustomed to fighting technologically primitive wars in Chechnya and Syria, Russia had learned nothing from the US operations during Desert Storm or subsequent conflicts, and was completely unprepared for the effect of smart weapons in combat. It's possible, however, that Russia didn't plan for these weapons to be in Ukraine. It may have not believed the US would provide them in the first place. Either way, HIMARS was immediately effective on the battlefield and disrupted Russia's offensive and ability to resupply its front lines. It was during the peak of the HIMARS offensive that Russia suffered the greatest losses among senior military officers, which had a cascading effect on Russia's ability to coordinate its forces on the ground. Unlike the West, Russia lacks a professional non-commissioned officer corps and still operates with a Soviet-style top-down command structure that discourages individual initiative. With each officer killed, it became harder for Russia to maneuver its forces and adapt quickly to threats, something we would see in full effect during the September counteroffensive in the Northeast. But the destruction of Russian ammunition dumps had a more direct impact on operations. Until HIMARS joined the battlefield, Russian artillery was doing what Russia does best, leveraging an incredible amount of pain and, if very indiscriminate, destruction. However, Russia had foolishly stockpiled its ammunition in a small number of very densely concentrated supply hubs for ease of distribution. This allowed Russia to quickly and efficiently resupply its artillery, which was consuming shells at a voracious rate, but it also left them incredibly vulnerable to long-range precision strikes. The artillery disparity between Russia and Ukraine, at times as high as 20-1, dropped significantly immediately after the strikes, allowing Ukraine to better position its forces for the future offensives. With its ammo stocks now widely dispersed into smaller hubs, Russia has also slowed the pace of its fire missions, relieving significant pressure across the front. The use of HARM missiles by the Ukrainian Air Force allowed it to take out a significant number of air defense units, or rather, all their important radars. This opened up gaps along the front where Ukrainian drones were able to operate again. However, HARM missiles also allowed Ukraine to destroy Russian counter-battery radars, which posed a big threat to Ukraine's own artillery. By tracking the flight path of incoming rounds via radar, Russia was able to deliver accurate counter-battery fire that destroyed any artillery too slow to shoot and scoot. The elimination of these radars allowed Ukraine the opportunity to move less mobile pieces of artillery closer to the front and deliver more punishing fire missions. Thoroughly disrupted, Ukraine's ground offensive caught the Russians completely by surprise and resulted in massive territorial losses and the decimation of some of Russia's best fighting forces, such as the vaunted 1st Guards Tank Army, a unit designed to beat the best that NATO could field. On the heels of overwhelming Ukrainian momentum, greater fighting spirit, and a numbers disparity that began to favor Ukraine as thousands of its conscripts began to join the fighting after months of training, Russia was forced on the defensive. And that's where we find Russia today, launching only limited offensives with barely if any gains to show for them. In response to the expected renewed counteroffensive, Russia has constructed a dense network of defenses, and they're unlikely to work. The Wagner private military company made headlines when it was revealed they'd constructed a dense network of anti-tank obstacles. These go by a variety of names, including Dragon's Teeth and Tiger's Teeth, but serve the same purpose they have for years: slow down an armored offensive. During World War II, they were very effective in slowing but not stopping U.S. armored forces entering Germany. These obstacles are typically buried partly in the ground to make them difficult to move and are built in very dense concentrations. The goal is to funnel forces through gaps in the defensive line, where artillery fire can be concentrated, similar to the use of barbed wire to channel infantry assaults. In the Second World War, they were a significant challenge, but the problem is modern vehicles have evolved greatly since then. There are already videos of Ukrainian vehicles simply driving over them, a very bumpy but manageable ride. If this wasn't bad enough, though, when Germany deployed them against the US, they were part of a defense network that ran several hundred miles long with significant defensive depth. Even as undermanned and equipped as the Siegfried Line was when the US pushed into Germany, it still managed to significantly slow the pace of the offensive but not stop it. Russia's modern defenses are much less dense than this and are facing modern forces that can blast paths with high explosives or simply drive directly over these rudimentary defenses. Without significant defensive depth, Russia's slowing of any offensive isn't going to buy enough time to bring overwhelming fire support to bear and destroy an assault force. Further, Russian fire support now has to contend with long-range precision artillery on Ukraine's side, as Ukraine is certain to concentrate its HIMARS and Excalibur precision artillery shells in the locations of these breakthrough assaults. Russian defensive doctrine does dictate the creation of defense in depth, with multiple networks of trenches, typically 3 with 10 kilometers of depth. This is why, as the Ukrainian counteroffensive began, nobody in the West was celebrating it as a success until a breakthrough achieved this magic number. While this isn't a strategically unsound doctrine, Russia's biggest vulnerability is its inability to respond to rapid changes in a combat environment or to bring precision fire down on targets. This is why the United States Brigade combat teams are smaller than the Russian equivalents, the Battalion Tactical Group, as the U.S. favors high mobility and the ability to attack on multiple fronts simultaneously to overwhelm Russian-style top-down command structures. Ukraine, operating with a similar American doctrine, is simply a much more nimble and adaptable force. The presence of Western precision munitions, as well as the ever-eroding morale and capabilities of Russia's largely conscript forces, is a strong indicator that Russia's defensive strategy is simply going to fail. This is why Russia's new defensive strategy is to try to call for a ceasefire. As the war progresses, both sides are forced to bring more and more conscripts into the fight. However, Ukrainian conscripts have the benefit of months of NATO standard training, often in NATO countries themselves. Russian conscripts instead are being increasingly rushed through a few weeks of training at best and thrown into the fight. The longer the war goes on, the greater the death toll on both sides, but increasingly skewed towards Russia, as its lower and lower quality troops are destroyed by more veteran Ukrainian troops and the ever more capable Western equipment slowly being made available to Ukraine. This is why Russia desperately needs a ceasefire, giving it the breathing room it badly needs to train conscripted troops and build better defenses. And this is why Ukraine should never agree to any ceasefire as long as Russian troops occupy any part of its territory. Ever wondered how we decide what to make videos about? We're gonna let you in on a little secret. It's vidIQ. It lets us see exactly how many searches per month a certain keyword gets. More searches means more potential viewers, but of course there's more.
Okay, so let's see. We're gonna go into factory. We're gonna need. I love this gun. This gun is my gun. Let's go. Let's see how this goes. Let me get a gas analyzer. I might be able to get it. I know it's custom and crumble. Words I never seen in words. Oh, the waiting game! Yeah! That's part of the game. It's a little bit smaller for
This is the moment the Ukrainian forces allegedly took out some 25 Russian soldiers in the battle for Soledar. Ukraine has claimed it decimated an entire enemy military unit in the salt mining town with a single HIMARS, a missile launcher mounted on a 5-ton truck. Footage shared on Telegram shows troops claimed to be from the Wagner group walking past rail tracks to find cover at a large building. Moments later, the entire building can be seen blown up in pieces by the missile. Smoke billowed into the air afterwards as a fire raged at the site where seconds earlier enemy soldiers were seeking shelter. Tracking of a Russian military unit and subsequent HIMARS/M270 strike at their location, Eastern Front, the Post read. Soledar, in eastern Ukraine, has become the center of some of the fiercest fighting in recent weeks. The Kremlin claims to have captured the town, already disputed by the Ukrainian government, but holding it may be another matter. Donetsk governor, Pavlo Kirilenko, said on Thursday the situation was difficult and that Russian troops were advancing from various directions. He stressed that the enemy had sustained a large number of casualties, including members of the Wagner mercenary group. Soledar remains under control of our military, though there is street fighting and also fighting outside of the city because the enemy is trying to advance in several directions. The enemy is incurring huge losses, he said in a video on Telegram. A video from yesterday morning shows a Ukrainian flag rising over the western part of Soledar. This comes after Yevgeny Prigozhin, Wagner's founder, boasted yesterday of his force's victory in the town. He likely seeks to use the victory as a bargaining tool to elevate his authority in Russia. The battle for Soledar became a point of contention between the private military group and the Russian Ministry of Defense over who should get the credit. Military experts have said Soledar itself is of little strategic importance for Russia. But the town has gained political significance as part of the objective to capture the entire Donetsk region. Military analysts question the strategic value of Soledar or nearby Bakhmut, which has also been the site of some of the most intense fighting in the war in recent weeks. Still, a Russian advance would be welcome news for the Kremlin following a string of embarrassing setbacks and Russian forces being unable to capture a single town in Ukraine since July 2022. Amid the push on the ground, the battles for both locales have killed thousands of soldiers on each side. Ukrainian command suggests any Russian gains on the Eastern Front would be a Pyrrhic victory due to how difficult it would be for Moscow to hold on to any advances following such heavy losses. Our task is to make the enemy exhausted, Nazarenko said. Bakhmut and the Bakhmut direction were a kind of trap for the enemy. Sooner or later, they will run out of steam, they say.
Thanks for watching, and don't forget.
Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In this video I want to talk to you about hedge funds. Now, as you're no doubt aware, 2022 was one of the worst years in terms of the financial markets. We saw the S&P 500 fall by 19.4% and Nasdaq actually fell by 33%. So this was a disastrous year if you were an investor generally. But hedge funds were established to be able to beat the markets. These guys could do trades in a different way. So what's the summary and conclusion today? venture business. 3.
Conclusion is I gotta wait. I got business. Time to die. 2 shots, 1 slug. That's factory. There's my game. Anything? Wow, 1 hit. Okay. Man, that goodness until level 10.
So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because I think hedge fund managers are revered in the world of finance. Everybody looks to them as the gurus. These guys are magic makers. They can make money even when everybody else is losing money. So I wanted to see whether or not that was true, to look at the statistics for a particularly difficult year. And what we saw was that they lost money. So overall, hedge fund managers were down by almost 5%. However, when you look at the performance within that market, there were some managers who actually did make significant profit, and a lot of them who lost their shirts, predominantly in the crypto markets and the equities markets. The overall performance was better than the indices did in 2022. However, that's what you expect. If you're paying 2% management fees and then potentially 25% performance fees, you want your fund manager to be performing significantly better than the market, because otherwise you could just put all of your money into a tracker stock and make profit without paying any of those fees. And I think what today's analysis showed is that when the markets go down, generally everybody is going to lose money. There might be the odd fund here and there that does make a profit, but overall, when the markets go down, we as investors tend to lose some of our investment. And 2023 looks like it's going to be a very challenging year for investors, and it is difficult to be able to decide what to invest into. Now, as I said earlier in the video, I'm not offering financial advice and I'm not standing behind any of the information that I've given you in this video, but I wanted to share it with you because it's always good to have the knowledge. It's always good to know what other people are thinking, because then you can make your assessment, do your own analysis, and decide whether or not you agree with those strategies, or if you entirely disagree and you decide that you want to do something entirely different. And that's really what the purpose of this channel is for, to really share with you as much information to make sure that you've got the facts and the figures, and you can decide what you want to do with your life, your investments, and your decisions. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video. It's a little bit different to my normal type of posting, but I wanted to mix things up a bit, throw a bit more.
This hour in LA.
A lot of people are very
The biggest problem with these things? They're nuanced, and we know how easily the general public engages with nuance. See, I have a pet theory that a large percentage of the aversion to CFLs came from people who really just didn't know that much about lighting in general. I would argue that the CFL was really the first mainstream way to get non-incandescent color temperatures in the home. Sure, fluorescent tubes weren't unheard of in the domestic environment. They found their place in garages and shop spaces. Sometimes kitchens had them, and linear over-the-mirror sort of deals in bathrooms were kind of common. But prior to the CFL, those sorts of odd applications defined what fluorescent light was. Fluorescent light was that cooler gray-blue light you saw at the office or in the store or maybe the basement. And see, here's where my theory comes in. If that was how you imagined fluorescent light, maybe you weren't even aware of the CFLs like this that mimicked the light from an incandescent bulb fairly well. Yes, I know there is and can even see the difference, but I would put money on there being lots of folks out there who wouldn't know this was a fluorescent light source unless they could see the bulb itself. Their imagination is that this is fluorescent. And when the very idea of color temperature is a new concept to a lot of people, I'd bet there was a lot of confusion that led to undeserved and sometimes misplaced hatred of these little fellas, no matter how hard store displays worked to show how warm the light actually could be. Again, this isn't meant to be a love letter to the CFL. They were bad in a fair number of ways, but even I, a really picky person when it comes to quality of light and color temperature, don't have a problem with most CFLs. Some were better than others, yeah, but at their peak, a nice 2700K CFL and a table lamp like this? No problem. About the worst thing I ever notice is a slightly pink, occasionally green cast to the light, but it's really only noticeable when you have another light to compare it to. If an entire room is lit with the same CFLs, my eyes would acclimate to it and I just couldn't see that color cast anymore. Of course, color rendering index isn't fantastic. It's really expensive to develop near-perfect phosphor formulations, so nearly all lamps were good but not great. But I don't think I've ever run across a warm white CFL that messed with colors to the point that I could notice without being hypercritical. I still have some CFLs kicking around without any intention to replace them until they fail. In many applications, their limitations just don't matter, so I'm not about to bother upgrading them needlessly. But, and this was in my opinion their Achilles heel, the suitableness of CFLs was very situational. They wanted to be and were sold as general-purpose light bulbs, but couldn't actually be used as such. Some fixtures were absolutely unfit for CFLs, despite the fact that CFLs could fit inside them. Similarly, some uses for them were impractical, and others would shorten their life considerably, leading many folks to believe that they didn't last as long as the incandescent lights they were supposed to outlive tenfold. And yeah, often they didn't. But in most cases, it wasn't really their fault. Let's start with those untimely deaths. Here's a fixture that seems perfectly appropriate for CFLs. Plenty of clearance for the lamps, not a problem. Except, yes, a problem. This fixture is enclosed. CFLs didn't get anywhere near as hot as the incandescent bulbs they replaced, but they still got hot. Trap one of them, or worse, multiple, inside a glass bowl with no airflow at all, and you've made a torture chamber for them. The electronic components in their integrated ballasts are only rated to a certain temperature, which can easily be exceeded in fixtures like these. And so, premature lamp failure was almost a given in enclosed fixtures. And to be fair, the packaging for these usually warned you that they weren't suitable in enclosed fixtures. But who reads the packaging? This is actually still something of a problem with LED bulbs, but many of them on the market today have electronics and temperature sensors designed to limit their output and prevent overheating, which allows them to be used without worry. But even simple orientation could be a problem with CFLs. If a fixture had its socket at the top and thus the bulb was hanging, a CFL would find itself with its ballast above the tube. The tube is the part that gets hottest, and since warm air rises, well, the ballast gets pretty hot. This wasn't always a problem. There could be enough airflow depending on the fixture's design, but often enough it was. More premature failures. Another thing that would kill them quickly? Frequent short use. Now, this problem
Осталось немного! Лошара, я-то думал, будет бой. Вон он, сука!
Фары врубай, вапел! Нехороший вы, блядь, человек!
Таких жалко кулак!
Well, that happened.
Problem didn't necessarily need to be a problem. But because we humans are impatient, fickle things, we didn't like bulbs that behaved like this one. A delay between switch on and light is certainly annoying, but this is much easier on the electrodes at the ends of the tube. This programming allows thermionic emissions from the filaments at the ends to help strike the arc. It's the easiest way to do that, and the most gentle on the electrodes. This particular bulb spent many years in a fixture on a timer and has undoubtedly racked up many thousands of hours, yet it still functions. But to the average person, this was just annoying, so instant start ballasts became the norm. These essentially just blast a high voltage charge right through the tube. And this does make for a delay-free start, but it comes at the expense of harming the electrodes. Each start wears them down a tiny bit, and while a long operating session may help restore them, when used in places like a closet or bathroom where the light is only on for a few minutes at a time, that opportunity simply doesn't exist. The great irony here was that the instant start ballasts made them seem more practical for these short use applications, but in actuality it made them much worse. The CFL was really best suited for general living space illumination that would be left on for long periods of time. But of course, much of that came from ceiling light fixtures like these, which would harm the bulbs but in a different way. Where they could really shine were in table and floor lamps. A lot of outdoor fixtures like these carriage things would do okay also. Really, just any fixture where it wasn't upside down and had decent airflow would do alright. But what about recessed cans? Those are always hanging bulbs upside down. Well, this wasn't the only style of CFL. In their heyday, we were brute forcing CFL tech into all sorts of weird and interesting places, like these imitation flood lamps. Some were even made to look like actual car lamps. Or, my particular favorite, these teeny tiny things that IKEA sold at one point, with an intermediate base to be just that extra bit of annoying. Still, even in suitable applications where they wouldn't overheat and die, CFLs still had drawbacks. A big unsolvable issue was that when you first turned them on, they hadn't yet gotten their Fulbright scholarship. Fluorescent lamps take time to warm up, as not all the mercury is a vapor when they're cold. For general purpose lamps like these at room temperatures, this wasn't a huge deal. They'd be about half their normal brightness when cold, certainly not at their best, but not unusable by any means either. And usually within just a minute or so, they'd be as bright as they'd get. But for whatever reason, most of the specialty bulbs that came about over the years would start out with next to useless brightness. Just take a look at this little flood thing. This is at room temperature but hasn't been started in a while. Turn it on, and that's barely anything. In fact, you can see the pink tinge brought about by the bit of neon in there used as a starter gas. Sometimes this would be purple, suggesting argon was the starter gas. Anyway, after a while it is nice and bright, but this is annoying. In my experience, nearly every non-standard CFL behaved just like this, be it flood, globe, A19 mimics, these weird little things. Really anything that wasn't the standard exposed curlicue. I'm really curious about why cold starts seem to be much worse in these specialty bulbs, especially since these floods, for example, are really just a standard lamp with a special shade. I have no idea why these should have darker starts than these ordinary lamps, yet they do. Only thing I can think of is that having the tube enclosed led to higher operating temps thanks to a lack of airflow, which required different vapor pressure characteristics, which ultimately meant weak, slow starts. And then, regardless of type, using CFLs outdoors was interesting. In cold temperatures, they'd be very dim at startup and could take several minutes to reach full brightness. For something like a porch light that'll be on all night, well, that's not too much of a problem, but when it gets really cold, well, they start to lose brightness. They can't actually reach their operating temperature when it's that cold, and on cold enough days, they may not even be able to start at all. Not ideal. And, as you can imagine, their proneness to death by overheating meant that in hot climates, they'd be even more at risk depending on the situation. Oh, and of course there's the elephant in the room, mercury. It's not great stuff. Now, in some senses, this problem was overblown. The amount of mercury that's actually in these is minuscule, and it's not like if you broke one, you'd need to exit the room in a panic and call a hazmat team, else you'll wake up the next day with an extra toe. Accidental breakage was not a 4-alarm fire kind of event, but at scale, disposing of these in landfills is not good. They should be recycled, and unfortunately, efforts to do this, particularly in the US it seems, were pretty sloppy. Some stores kept receptacles for you to return dead bulbs. IKEA was particularly good at this, but plenty of places left you in the dark on how to deal with a bulb. During these miniaturizing fluorescent lights into these tiny things was a feat of its own, and I appreciate it greatly. CFLs also finally spurred development of warm white phosphor formulations that weren't terrible. I mean, this Circline tube is just horrid. That is not a warm and pleasant glow, GE. It's sickly. These were just misunderstood. I bet many of you can think back to a few of these that just kept on trucking. In fact, maybe you're like me and still have some going strong. When they were used in an appropriate application, they really weren't half bad. If anything is to blame for their reputation, I think it's that their abilities were oversold. A lot of them died too young simply because of how they were used, and it's not their users' fault. Manufacturers just want to sell you light bulbs, so they're not likely to help you figure out those details. And again, and I know I've said this like a million times,
Hello everyone, this is your daily dose of internet. The police came to stop these protesters, but they got stuck in the mud. The mud appeared to have no effect on the wizard whatsoever.
Avery.
But I'm pretty sure my shift I get off early.
Do the zombie scream.
This is proof that my husband actually sleeps with his eyes open. Colton.
This is what happens when a news anchor orders food at a drive-thru.
Hi, good morning. I'd like to order the Steakhouse Angus Thick Burger at Carl's Jr. in Sacramento. I'd like to hold the thickness. Add a side. Are you laughing? Ma'am. I'm scared. Are you okay?
While waiting at a red light, this guy noticed that this woman left her phone on top of her car. So I guess if you're a white person and you go to India, you will instantly become a celebrity. This woman visited India and everyone wanted to take a picture with her.
This is how it is non-stop here. There's a waiting line over here. She's inundated.
Oh my god, are you okay?
Sick.
This baby was making fun of her grandma for not having any teeth. These girls talked to a bartender to see if it would be worth going to the bar.
How many cute boys are there right now?
Literally like 3.
Oh, okay.
This is how the Canadian military wakes up anyone caught sleeping on the job. This diver knows how to defend himself from slow-motion turtle attacks. This plane was struck by lightning, but nobody was hurt, and the plane landed safely without any issues. This person realized that you can sneak unpaid merchandise through these detectors as long as you do a cool dance. This dad forgot to bring his glasses, but this restaurant is so fancy that they have an entire case of glasses to borrow.
You can say the words, Mom?
Yeah.
You see the words? Yes, you sure?
Yes.
Okay.
That is the end of this video. I really hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you guys again very, very soon.
Тюремщику все продам и заживем. Сука, отстрелялся нахуй!
Well, I got you that. Headshot, huh? Scab. Not bad. Could have done a little bit better there, but whatever. Wow.
Callisto Protocol. The hype surrounding this game was palpable before launch, to say the least. It was one of my most anticipated games of 2022, and it was the case for a lot of people. But then the game came out, and people were definitely disappointed. It wasn't like the worst game that's ever come out or anything. I personally had more positive-leaning mixed feelings towards it, but it certainly didn't live up to the anticipation surrounding the game. The meta score is sitting at a 69, nice, and the user score is sitting at a 68. It is agreed upon that this game has enough issues that it cannot be held in the highest regard. But I do think there is enough of an interesting foundation there where if they extrapolate on it more and if they can refine things more, you can make a really great next entry. I really hope there's a sequel to this game personally. I do think there's potential for this IP, but the likelihood of a sequel has been diminished by the fact that, well, the game has not sold particularly well. The following information was reported by Korean news outlet K-Odyssey, and here's a headline that paints a grim picture for the future of the Callisto Protocol IP. Krafton's 200 billion won, not dollars, won, paid new game sluggish. Securities companies lowering target stock prices. Scrolling down, it is once again reiterated that Callisto Protocol, which was released last month, back in December of 2022, cost about 200 billion won over 3 years to make. Translated into dollars, for those who don't know, that's around $160 million, which is definitely up there in terms of AAA game budgets. Based on analysis from securities firms like Daishin Securities, Samsung Securities, Shinhan Securities, Kiwoom Securities, Korea Investment and Securities, and Hyundai Motor Securities, the sales that they've been seeing surrounding the game don't seem to indicate a positive profit outcome for this venture, and so they've lowered their target stock prices of Krafton from last month to early this month. The main reason being the failure, they call it, of Callisto Protocol. One of the securities firm, Samsung Securities, stated that the expectation was for Callisto Protocol to sell around 5 million copies total in its lifetime, but considering the current sales ranking, cumulative sales of 2 million copies will not be easy until this year. They're saying that 2 million copies is the most optimistic outcome for Callisto Protocol, which when you consider that number, that's actually a pretty good number for a brand new sci-fi horror IP, but because of the amount of money that Krafton spent on this particular project and just the amount of money that it didn't make back, the 2 million figure, even though it's considered a positive figure by many standards, when it comes to the financial prospects and the profit margins, it's gonna ultimately end up not meeting the lofty expectations set for this game. Just to give you some context, to reach $160 million, to break even on the amount of money that they spent on this game, they'd have to sell at $70 price point roughly 2.3 million units, and that's without taking into consideration the, say, 30% that platforms are owed. Taking that into consideration, we'll be looking at figures closer to 3.3 million units to achieve $160 million worth of revenue. So to make a good amount of money from Callisto Protocol, 4 to 5 million units sold would be the ideal outcome, but apparently, that's nowhere close to the figures that we're going to see out of Callisto Protocol's total sales. Another securities firm, Korea Investment and Securities, lowered its cumulative sales estimate from 4 million to 2.1 million, not too different from what Samsung Securities said here. And they lowered its operating profit estimate from 813 billion won to 629.3 billion won. That's the operating profit estimate for Krafton as a whole for this year. So 813 billion won to 629.3 billion won. That's in US dollars, lowering the estimate from $654 million to $506 million. They lowered the estimate by roughly $150 million for this year, which, yeah, that's rough. That's solely based on Callisto Protocol's commercial failure. Commercial failure in the eyes of the corporations who invested a certain amount of money and expected a certain amount of return. The article then makes it a point to highlight all of the factors that contributed to the lower sales. Gamers' reviews are negative. Although graphics and sound technology are excellent, the length of the game is too short to be cleared in about 7 to 8 hours, and the stage formation is also simple. It's not just a commercial flop, but critically, it didn't do particularly well either. And for me, the length of the game wasn't the biggest issue. I do agree that the level design was overly simplistic. There were no puzzles to mix things up. It was going from point A to point B, killing a bunch of monsters, loot some stuff, and then go from point B to point C, rinse and repeat. And the game was very linear as well, which didn't help the lack of puzzles or just something to mix up the gameplay loop. Enemy variety was extremely lacking. It felt like you were basically fighting the same enemies from beginning to end. And the final boss, there was a lot of frustration around that. The dodge mechanic also had mixed reception because instead of having a dedicated dodge button, the way you dodge is essentially by moving from left to right, and it wasn't even timing based. You essentially could hold left and right, and the game would just auto dodge, but sometimes the auto dodge would be finicky. Really, the most impressive aspect of Callisto Protocol is just how gorgeous it looks. With that in mind, the cost from game production to release is expected to be great.
So I'm sure most of you are aware of constellations. You know, you have your Sagittarius, Scorpius, Capricornus, and so on and so forth. But to NASA scientists, these are usually known as the optical constellations, something that's only visible in the optical light. But if you've been watching a lot of videos on this channel, You're probably aware that we also have the infrared map of the universe, we have the microwave map, the radio map, X-ray map, and more excitingly, the gamma ray map. In other words, the actual night skies will look completely different in various frequencies. You can learn more about these maps in some of the previous videos in the description, but today we're focusing on new discoveries in the gamma ray frequencies. Hello wonderful person, this is Anton, and so today we're going to be discussing the potential solution to the Fermi bubble mystery. The strange bubbles, discovered back in 2010 by the gamma ray telescope known as Fermi, that discovered these unusual structures emanating from the center of the galaxy. But before we talk about the mystery and the explanation, let me actually just go back to that map I showed you previously. So this map right here that was made by NASA a few years ago. And here we have optical constellations, but we also get gamma ray constellations. Basically, in the last few years, the scientists have also proposed a bunch of gamma ray constellations only visible in the gamma ray light. But in this case, because these are modern constellations, for the most part they have really geeky, really nerdy, and somewhat funny names. And by the way, this is an actual thing, this actually exists. The link for this is in the description below. So here we have the Fermi constellation, named after the Fermi satellite, but as you can see next to it we have the Targus constellation. Hopefully I don't have to explain where this is from. Right above it we have the Hulk, we have the Eiffel Tower, the Little Prince, the Obelisk, Saturn V rocket, and my favorite, the Godzilla. Sort of looks like this in the actual constellation, and this is with the artwork. There are a bunch of other ones, some of them are really funny, once again in the description, but the point here is that we've discovered so many different gamma ray objects that the scientists had to start proposing different names in order to identify them easier. Starship Enterprise, for example. But by looking at this with more sensitivity, we'll actually start seeing something a little bit different. Here's roughly what you see with the diffuse gamma ray light. And notice how there are these two unusual structures going below the galaxy and above the galaxy itself. Or let's be more specific here. Covering the Mjolnir constellation, the Targus constellation, the Fermi satellite constellation, and the right hand of the Hulk constellations. And that's what we call the Fermi bubbles. But more intriguingly, by looking at these structures in other light, the scientists started to discover other formations as well. This is in the X-rays, suggesting that these structures are very likely connected. And in this case, this was only discovered back in 2020, 10 years later. And so almost right away to the scientists, this implied one thing. Something extremely powerful must have happened in the center of the Milky Way to produce these formations. And because a lot of similar formations have been observed in other galaxies, with many of them already explained very thoroughly, the origin here was most likely due to the supermassive black hole right in the center of the Milky Way. And so that's what the scientists have believed for the past 12 to 13 years. But it wasn't entirely clear what produced this though. It was not really argued that these were from the central black hole, but the actual event was not clear. For example, was this some kind of a tidal disruption event, where a star comes really close to the black hole and becomes absorbed in the process? Or was this something related to much longer events, such as the ones we usually observe from radio galaxies? Or maybe something entirely different, producing various galactic winds. So the actual origin of Fermi bubbles was not entirely clear, but because gamma rays are generally produced by extremely powerful events, whatever caused it had to be very powerful as well. And this is like 50,000 light years across, and visible in both gamma rays and X-rays, so there's a lot of energy involved here. So what exactly could have happened here around the central black hole to produce all of this? And in the past, several scientists have tried to answer this question, but their answers were not super conclusive. This time though, this Japanese scientist decided to try to answer this by using a combination of modeling, simulations, and of course mathematics, in order to provide us with a relatively good answer, and actually a potentially important answer that we need to consider. So here's what he discovered. His explanations and his modeling actually explains both the gamma ray and the X-ray emissions. And he found that all of this seems to be caused by fast-moving wind slamming into the gas in the galaxy that end up producing very specific shock waves through the collision of charged particles with the interstellar medium. And as these shock waves bounce around, they create a lot of reverse shock waves that then heat up the material and produce the X-rays and the gamma rays observed. With a lot of this new data coming from the Japanese Suzaku satellite that provided even more X-ray data. And when tracing all of this back in time to the source, it becomes clear what most likely produced this: long-lasting galactic winds with the expelled material moving at the speed of about 1000 km per second, but lasting for about 10 million years at least. And that's why, of course, these bubbles are about 50,000 light years across, and why we're still seeing the emissions even today. This is basically a result of about 10 million years of activity. However, when he tried to reproduce the same effects by using just one collision or some kind of a tidal disruption event, or essentially when a star gets destroyed by a black hole and produces really powerful emissions for a relatively short time, he was not really able to reproduce the same observations, meaning that the Fermi bubbles are not likely created by something like this. And so if not tidal disruption events, it had to be much longer galactic winds that we've seen from so many different galaxies already. And if the scientist in this case is correct, it suggests that all of this very likely finished relatively recently, within the last few million years, and possibly even within the last 3 million years, which of course has a bit of an implication on what effects this might have had on the atmosphere of planet Earth. For example, is there any way we can maybe explain some of the previous climatic changes by the detection coming from the Milky Way center? Although it's actually important to understand that galactic winds can be caused by at least 2 separate events. In this case, you're looking at MA2, an iconic galaxy with visible galactic winds. But the galactic winds here are not caused by the central black hole. They're caused by a dramatic increase in starburst activity, various stars being created, exploding as supernova, and creating extremely powerful pressure events that end up pushing a lot of the gas into the intergalactic space. Something that could have happened in the Milky Way galaxy as well, and so it's not super clear if the Fermi bubbles were produced by the black hole or by some kind of an increase in star forming activity. But if this was produced,
that was too quick. I don't know, I'm not sure. Here's what the back 18 is. Have debut done. I already got Jacker's Camp. I need to get gas analyzed. I don't want to that was way too quick.
used by a black hole, It means that Sagittarius A star's supermassive black hole can occasionally become superactive, potentially consuming huge amounts of gas coming from somewhere else in the central galaxy, and doing so for at least 10 million years. And so exactly what caused the galactic wind is not super clear just yet. Nevertheless, these events are usually really important for the galactic evolution. They tend to distribute a lot of materials throughout the galaxy and also regulate star formation in other regions. Sometimes they can stop star formation, sometimes they can create pressure waves to start star formation somewhere else. And at the same time, it blows a lot of material into the halo of the galaxy, which sometimes returns back into the galaxy later on, providing more materials to the outskirts or starting more star formation in farther away regions. And so it's actually a super complicated process that the scientists still don't really understand really well, but it's something that's definitely going to affect the galaxy in the next few millions of years. Although in this case, because the wind was extremely slow and steady, and also because it seems to emanate in two separate directions, kind of similar to a typical black hole emission, it's a lot more likely that all of this was probably caused by Sagittarius A star. It's obviously not clear where all this material came from, but it must have come from somewhere. And here you had to have a lot of material to feed the black hole. Remember, this lasted for 10 million years. And the wind is still traveling away from the center even today, with a velocity of about 1000 km per second. So definitely a pretty good explanation. But now I'm genuinely curious what effects this might have had on planet Earth, if any. And more intriguingly, if this is galactic wind, it probably also came toward planet Earth as well. I mean, the distance from the top to the bottom here is about 25,000 light years, and the distance from the central black hole to planet Earth is around the same as well. And so it would definitely be interesting to find out what effects, if any, this would have on our planet. But today, Sagittarius A star is a really timid, really quiet black hole, compared to the ones in other
Let everybody know, for fuck's sake.
А вот тут друган мой бывал точно. Вот петух. Опачки.
Well, let's get ready.
Нормально, живем, пацаны. Ща к барыгам, а потом по бабам. О! Граната! Ты гнида. Вон он, сука! Вот петух! Шалава! Гнида! Блядь, берца, щеми! Щеми берцов! Шалава!
утра выпил, весь день свободен. I had the chance, well, whatever. Nothing wasted.
Nearly a year ago, at the beginning of 2022, the Russian armed forces deployed tens of thousands of troops into Belarus, a relatively small country of about 9 million people whose government is a very close ally of the Kremlin and whose territory is immediately to the west of Russia and to the north of Ukraine. Belarus's southern border with Ukraine extends for more than 1,000 kilometers across largely flat, open, and marshy terrain, and is crucially placed fewer than 90 kilometers away from Ukraine's capital and largest city, Kyiv. These facts make Belarus a vitally strategic location for Russia's invasion plans into Ukraine. And so, after Belarus allowed the Russians to pile up around 30,000 of their troops on the southern border in February of 2022, the Russians launched their initial blitzkrieg attack by storming across the border towards Kyiv. Their objective was to quickly occupy and conquer the Ukrainian capital, overthrow the government of Volodymyr Zelensky, and force a quick end to the war on Russia's own terms, which would have likely involved establishing a puppet government in Ukraine that would have granted the Russians their desired territorial conquests in the east. But of course, that's not how things ended up turning out. Ukrainian resistance was significantly fiercer than the Russians had anticipated, while the Russians' own logistics, planning, equipment, and morale proved significantly worse than they initially believed. After suffering thousands of casualties and failing to capture Kyiv, the surviving Russians withdrew back across the border towards the safety of Belarus, and left a path of scorched earth behind in their wake, like in Bucha, where hundreds of civilians and prisoners of war had been hastily shot. But Russian missile systems and artillery based within Belarus have continued to bomb targets within Ukraine throughout the months of the war that have followed. And now it appears that yet another Russian attack from Belarus against Kyiv may be building and coming very soon. Western satellite images have revealed increasingly concentrated military activity within Belarus near to the Ukrainian border. It's now estimated by Western intelligence that around 20,000 Russian troops have entered the country once again and are massing in the south near the border with Ukraine. Railways from Russia have been flowing through Belarus with military hardware and equipment, and brand new roads are being sliced through the forest towards the border. These are all troubling signs that could be pointing towards a second Russian attack from Belarus on the Ukrainian capital nearly a year after the first attempt failed. And there are fears that this time, the Belarusian army itself may be joining in alongside the Russians in the attack. But if that's true, why has it taken this long for Belarus, a nominal ally of Russia, to formally one with more than 4.6? The only thing really keeping Lukashenko in power in Belarus are the Belarusian armed forces, which remain largely loyal to Lukashenko personally. But compared to the Russian or even the Ukrainian armed forces, the Belarusian armed forces are vastly inferior. Military service in Belarus is compulsory for all men in the country who generally serve an 18-month term. Because of this, the Belarusian armed forces and reserves are almost entirely made out of conscripts instead of professional volunteers. It's estimated that there are currently around 344,000 men in the reserves and 62,000 additional active duty troops in the armed forces. But Western intelligence currently estimates that as few as 10,000 of those active duty troops are actually combat ready and immediately able to carry out offensive operations. That's not very many. And to make matters even worse, they are nearly universally equipped with old Soviet-era weaponry and equipment that is by this point at least 30 years old, if not even more. This is a force that could not possibly withstand an assault from the Russians, who, despite all of their failings in Ukraine so far, still have hundreds of thousands of combat-ready troops that could quickly cast aside the 10,000 combat-ready Belarusians if they resisted. But they won't resist because Lukashenko is aware of his own vulnerability. And because of that vulnerability, he also doesn't want to commit those precious few troops.
Used and abused.
Troops into a war in Ukraine, where many of them are likely to get themselves killed. After the first Russian advance on Kyiv from Belarus failed in early 2022, the Ukrainians learned their lesson and began covering the entire border region with landmines to deter any future offensive coming from the same direction. Were Lukashenko to commit his 10,000 poorly equipped, combat-ready troops to a new attack into Ukraine with the 20,000 Russian troops in the country, it is likely that they would suffer high casualties. And the higher rate of casualties they suffer, the less Belarusian troops would be available at home to safeguard Lukashenko's fragile grip on power from slipping. It's further likely that the Belarusian population would not accept high levels of casualties and long trains of their boys coming back in body bags. Belarus is a country that has long maintained an official policy of neutrality and pacifism, largely owing to its horrific experiences during the Second World War. Located precisely in the center of the bloodlands of Eastern Europe, wedged in between Hitler and Stalin, Belarus suffered a higher percentage of their population lost in the war than any other country in the world did. Some 25%, or 1 in 4, of all Belarusians were wiped out in a matter of 4 years between 1941 and 1945. Belarusian civilians have never wanted to experience the horrors that can be wrought from warfare ever again. And as a consequence, the British think tank Chatham House found last year that 79% of Belarusians believe that the deaths of their soldiers in Ukraine would be an unacceptable cost for their country to bear. Lukashenko's refusal for nearly a year now to send Belarusian troops to fight alongside of the Russians in Ukraine has therefore bought him a kind of goodwill with many Belarusians that would become immediately soured were he to change his mind and send them in anyway. Nonetheless, there has been a notable amount of Belarusian resistance against him for just allowing the Russians to use their country to attack Ukraine. There have been at least 80 reported incidents since the war began of brave Belarusian partisans sabotaging railways in the country to prevent the transport of Russian troops and equipment to the front lines. Despite the Lukashenko regime labeling such sabotage as acts of terrorism that will carry the death penalty by gunshot if caught and convicted. Hundreds of Belarusians with relevant combat experience have also defected and joined the Ukrainian armed forces in their struggle, with many believing that Ukraine's fight against Soviet-era authoritarianism is Belarus's fight as well. If Ukraine emerges completely victorious in the war and Putin loses his grip on power in Russia as a consequence, then Lukashenko will lose his biggest backer and will likely lose his own power as well. Whatever happens in Ukraine is inexorably linked to whatever happens in Belarus. The Belarusian volunteers fighting for Ukraine therefore know that if Lukashenko commits the bulk of the Belarusian armed forces to the invasion,
house. Hmm. Okay, so railway road customs. Airboat. Road customs, railway bridge, and front line. Well. Fence. Man, I gotta go all the way. Oh, that's another. I go down, hit the road. Okay, let's go down, hit the main road, try to get to the road cut. the best. Something. Not the best, but cool. To the fox match over there. That's keep going on this way, like you can downtown. Going down. This is the path to the lighthouse? What? Am I dumb? Did it run through? Does that count? I don't understand. Okay, I'll take it, I guess. I found some stuff. Cool. I'm confused, but happy. I got a scar over there, I guess, you know. Coolio, gangsters.
You want me there too?
Russian troops in Makiivka were having a party for New Year's Eve. This is one of their last pictures before HIMARS missiles wiped them and another 600 Russian soldiers out. This brand new Russian T-90M ProRev 3 with Nikitka thermal camouflage is burning somewhere in the Luhansk region. Allegedly a Swedish delivered AT-4, unit costs $1,480, has been used to knock it out. $5 million in Russian taxpayer money gets smoked.
Okay, I'm back.
So
Okay, so well now nice. Okay, what's next? Still gonna get those shotguns. Guns and stuff. What?
Kharkiv offensive. Recon into Russian positions. Soldiers of the International Legion next to the destroyed Russian BMP-2M. GoPro is from soldier who took out the BMP-2M with MLAW.
I am the law.
You want me there too? Road is empty. I hope there's no one in there. Road is clear. Go. No, I know, but you just wanted that security on the road, right? We can hold it from this compound. It's more comfortable.
While Russia loses billions at war, Skabayeva is worried about losses at British brothels. Apparently train strikes led to losing profits for them.
А вот в Британии забастовки железнодорожников привели в том числе к тому, что британские проститутки впервые не могут дождаться своих клиентов, которые попросту не могут добраться до...
Today.
Okay, now, get up. It takes time. Let's see what it is. Factory up there.
пацаны. Чё тут за хуйня? Вон он, сука!
it'll be easier to find it on Shoreline, but there's already not the time. Maybe tomorrow.
In 1966, a well-known scientist released a book with information that could impact everyone on Earth. But before anyone could read it, it was classified by the CIA. We only learned about it a few years ago when it was declassified. But the CIA only released 57 pages of the original 284-page manuscript. And those pages have been, in the CIA's own words, sanitized. Now, why does the CIA think this book is so dangerous that they had to hide it from the public for 60 years and continue to hide most of it? Well, it's because the man who wrote it describes the end of the world. In 1966, former McDonnell Douglas engineer Dr. Chan Thomas released a book called The Adam and Eve Story. Now, that title might sound like he's being cute, but he's actually being literal. This book is about the end of the world as we know it.
Hey.
What's up?
Is this one of those stories where you scare the hell out of us? Then you wrap it up with a happy ending?
Well, you're half right.
No. If I soil my bowl again, you gotta remember to edit that out.
They didn't know you had an accident. You just told them.
Well...
Thomas presents evidence of a coming shift in the Earth's poles that creates a cataclysm. And Thomas says these pole shifts are cyclical, that on regular intervals, a disaster wipes out almost all human life, and we start over again in the Stone Age. He says we're actually the 6th advanced civilization to evolve on Earth. There may have been even more civilizations that have been here, but the further back you go, the harder it is to know for sure because some of these civilizations occupied continents that no longer exist. Now, Thomas isn't the first scientist to publish this theory. In 1958, almost 10 years before the Adam and Eve story, Charles Hapgood published The Earth's Shifting Crust, which discussed the Earth crustal displacement hypothesis. This theory says that sometimes the Earth spins really fast and the continents are rearranged. When Hapgood proposed the idea of continental drift, it was called pseudoscience. But Hapgood had his supporters. In fact, Albert Einstein wrote the forewords for 2 of his books. Now, of course, we know that Hapgood was right. The continents do move. They drift apart and collide together over and over again, and have done so for almost 4 billion years. Pangaea was the supercontinent that broke apart to form the land masses that exist today. But before Pangaea, there was the supercontinent Gondwana, which existed for 400 million years. Before Gondwana, there was Pannotia. Before that, Rodinia, Columbia, Atlantica, Arctica, Kennerland, Ur, and Valbara. These were all supercontinents that eventually broke apart and reformed. After working with Einstein and a few other scientists, Charles Hapgood released the book The Path of the Pole as an update to his previous theories. In this book, Hapgood suggested that the Earth's poles are constantly moving. Again, this piece of pseudoscience was eventually proven true. Hapgood believed that a pole shift between 15 and 40 degrees occurred around 9600 BC, or 11,600 years ago.
Younger Dryas.
Younger Dryas. Now, the Piri-Reis map is something that has baffled scientists for hundreds of years. On the Piri-Reis map is the continent of Antarctica, but Antarctica wasn't discovered until 1820, and Piri-Reis claimed the information on his map came from much older maps. If Charles Hapgood was right and the Earth's axis was shifted 15 degrees from where it is now, Antarctica wouldn't be completely covered in ice. Hapgood believed an Ice Age civilization, long forgotten, mapped the coast thousands of years ago. Though many of Hapgood's theories have proven to be true, the Ice Age pole shift is still controversial. We do know the poles shift over time. We also know the continents drift over a very long period of time. But Dr. Chan Thomas, in his book The Adam and Eve Story, says the shift happens in less than a day. Chan Thomas describes in detail what this will be like, and it's worse than any Hollywood disaster movie ever conceived. Far worse. Chan Thomas begins his book with a chapter that describes exactly what we'll experience during this pole shift event. But before we get into it, now might be a good time to hit pause and grab fresh underwear.
I've learned to listen to him when he says that.
With a rumble so low as to be inaudible, then fueling into a thundering roar, the earthquake starts. Only it's not like any earthquake in history. In California, mountains shake like ferns in a breeze. A mighty Pacific rears back and piles up into a mountain of seawater more than 2 miles high, then starts its race eastward. The wind attacks, shredding everything in supersonic bombardment. The mountain of Pacific seawater follows the wind eastward, burying Los Angeles and San Francisco as if they were but grains of sand. Across the continent, the 1,000-mile-per-hour wind wreaks unholy vengeance everywhere, mercilessly.
Now here's why there's such violent wind. The Earth spins about 1,000 miles per hour. We don't feel this because everything is spinning together. The land, the water, the atmosphere. Now Thomas says that when the pole shift happens, the Earth's air and water continue to spin, but the land masses stop.
In many places, the Earth's molten sublayer breaks through and spreads a sea of white-hot liquid fire. In a fraction of a day, all vestiges of civilization are gone, and the great cities, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Chicago, Dallas, New York, Boston, are nothing but legends. Barely a stone is left where millions walked just a few hours ago.
Now think of what would happen if you were in a car going 1,000 miles per hour that suddenly stopped. Now think of what would happen if a large city going 1,000 miles per hour suddenly stopped. Skyscrapers would collapse. Millions of people would be thrown around like they were in a food processor. Very few people would survive that, but survivors are the unlucky ones. Because moving across the country at the speed of sound is a 2-mile-high wall of water, mud, and debris.
South America finds the Andes not high enough to stop the violence. In less than a day, the entire continent is burned by molten earth fire, buried under miles of violent seas, then turned into a frozen hell. Everything freezes: man, beast, plant, and mud in less than 4 hours.
When the shift happens, the land on Earth stops moving, so the sun stops moving in the sky. That means one side of the Earth is going to get really hot, and the other side really cold. A temperature drop of 180 degrees. That means even the warmest parts of the planet are going to be 80 degrees below zero. Everything is frozen solid within 4 hours.
Europe cannot escape. The Alps, Pyrenees, Urals are shrunken, then heaved even higher when the wall of seawater strikes. Western Africa and the sands of the Sahara vanish. The fury marches on for 6 days. During the 6th day, the ocean starts to settle. The Bay of Bengal Basin just east of India is now at the North Pole. The Pacific Ocean just west of Peru is at the South Pole. New ice caps begin to form in the new polar areas. Greenland and Antarctica, now rotating equatorially, emerge with verdant tropical foliage.
Thomas is predicting a 90-degree shift to the Earth's axis, basically turning the
and Antarctica, now rotating equatorially, emerge with verdant tropical foliage.
Thomas is predicting a 90-degree shift to the Earth's axis, basically turning the planet on its side. The poles move to the equator, and the equator moves to the poles.
New York lies at the bottom of the Atlantic, covered by unbelievable amounts of mud. Of San Francisco, Los Angeles, Chicago, Dallas, and Boston, not a trace is left. The cataclysm has done its work and drives the pitiful few who survive into a new Stone Age. We join Noah, Adam and Eve, Atlantis, Mu and Olympus, and Jesus joins Osiris, Tahora, Zeus, and Vishnu.
In the first chapter of his book, Dr. Thomas paints a terrifying future. But how likely is it? In the next few chapters, Thomas goes on to not only prove his pole shift is possible, that it's happened before and will happen again very soon. In fact, there are signs that it may have already begun. Every culture has a flood myth. Abrahamic religions have Noah's flood. The Mayans have the Huracan flood, where the word hurricane comes from. Ancient Hawaiians have the Nu'u flood. The Sumerians wrote about a flood in Gilgamesh. Europe, Asia, Pacific Islanders, and native tribes from all over America. They all talk about a great flood that cleansed the earth so civilization could start again. Now, one myth is just folklore. 2 myths are a coincidence. 4D flood myths? This starts to look less like a myth and more like actual history. Now, on this channel, we typically associate great floods with the end of the last ice age, the Younger Dryas. And core samples provide solid evidence that this happened. But what's interesting is, Thomas said the last great flood wasn't 11,500 years ago, but 6,500 years ago. Now, in the 1960s, there was very little, if any, proof of this, but a few years ago, archaeologists found evidence of the Gunyu flood myth in China. Evidence of a great flood has been found in the Mediterranean and in the Black Sea. These discoveries put the flood between 6,500 and 7,000 years ago, more recent than the Younger Dryas, and right when Thomas says it happened. Chan Thomas provides the dates of other floods. The Younger Dryas is about 11,500 years ago. Before that, a flood 18,500 years ago. And this is exactly the time when the Bering Land Bridge went underwater. Before that, 29,000 years ago, which was the end of the Wisconsin glacial period. And before that, 43,800 years ago. But global floods aren't controversial. We know they happened. What is controversial is the claim that advanced civilizations existed before each of the floods. Mainstream archaeology and paleontology say the first civilization emerged in Mesopotamia 6,500 years ago. But what if that was just the last reboot?
Ooh, like the Batman movies?
Exactly.
The Dark Knight Rises is the best one.
Can we discuss Batman later? I'm trying to talk about the end of the world here.
Ooh, that's why I keep interrupting.
Coward. When we look at the erosion around the base of the Great Sphinx, we see patterns that were formed by running water. Vast amounts of water moving at tremendous speeds. But if this is water erosion, that means the Sphinx was created before the last flood 6,500 years ago, which is before the emergence of the Egyptian civilization. Archaeologists hate that idea. And they really hate the idea that the Sphinx was built over 10,000 years ago. But there's other evidence of a cataclysmic pole shift, specifically of a great mud flood and a sunken continent.
Do you mean?
I mean Atlantis.
It's Jemima!
Chan Thomas makes some pretty extreme claims in the Adam and Eve story. Extraordinary claims need extraordinary evidence. In his dialogues, Plato famously introduced the world to Atlantis, the advanced utopian society that was destroyed in a cataclysm. Now, until definitive proof of Atlantis is found, it will continue to be considered a mythical land. But that won't and shouldn't stop people from looking for it. There is a geological feature in Northwest Africa called the Richat structure, also called the Eye of the Sahara. It's about the right size and shape for Atlantis. Plato described the city as concentric rings with a waterway flowing out. But even among Atlantis believers, there's debate about whether this is a man-made structure or a natural one. But what I find fascinating is near the Eye of the Sahara and all over the planet, you'll see large ripples in the landscape. Now on the ground, these look like rolling hills, but they're actually about 50 feet high, the size of a 5-story building. And they were caused by water. A lot of water.
This is one of the craziest things you'll ever see.
These ripples, repeated ripples, in an area where there's nothing else like it.
This is the fingerprints of the flood. That's what it is.
Wow.
The water here, Joe, that did this, the way to visualize this is to, again, begin to think a tsunami. Here, what you have to visualize is a tsunami sweeping over the land that's over 1,000 feet deep. And it's sweeping down over this land at probably 200 or 300 million cubic feet per second, which is an inconceivable amount of water.
But Atlantis isn't the only place lost to this disaster. On the other side of the world, we have another lost continent. This is called the Land of Mu. Mu was described by Augustus Le Plongeon and later by James Churchward, both of whom translated very old texts from the Maya and India. Both of these cultures, on opposite sides of the world, describe a vast continent in the Pacific that reached Hawaii in the north, and as far south as Easter Island, and as far west that it almost reached the islands of Japan. James Bramwell and William Scott Elliott, both proponents of this theory, claim the continent was destroyed in a cataclysm 11,500 years ago. There's that date again. The Yonaguni Monument off the coast of Japan is said to be the underwater ruins of Mu. Nam Madal in Micronesia is considered to be the southern part of Mu. The site is full of structures made of enormous logs of volcanic rock. Nobody knows who built this or how, but their society was advanced. Just recently, LiDAR imaging from the air shows that at one time, Nam Madal had an artificial irrigation system that could bring fresh water to residents all over the area. The eastern part of Mu is Easter Island, and there could be evidence of a cataclysm there. On Easter Island are the Moai statues, and you've seen these. It's lots of heads, about 1,000 actually. And most people don't realize that these statues have bodies buried deep underground. So there are two options. One, whoever built the statues first dug holes, then buried 30-foot tall, 80-ton statues up to their necks, then filled in the holes. Or two, the statues were completely above ground, but at some point were buried by something. And look at Easter Island. It's a tiny island in the middle of nowhere. At one point, 12,000 people lived there. Where did they come from? Mainstream anthropology says that people from Polynesia took a canoe out thousands of miles in the middle of the Pacific and hoped for the best. But if the continent of Mu was real, then they could have just walked there. This could also explain why Polynesian languages share similarities to Greek, and maybe why on Easter Island they worshipped a sun god called Ra, which is awfully close to the Egyptian sun god Ra. And the connections don't stop there. There are similarities between Greek, Egyptian, and even Indian gods, as if all these cultures intermingled or
Yeah.
came from a single source. Chan Thomas lays out some good evidence for the cyclical cataclysm theory. But the big questions are how and when will it happen? Well, you're not going to like the answer. Dr. Chan Thomas lays out a compelling argument for a coming global cataclysm. But when? Well, to answer that, we have to understand how it happens. In the story of Adam and Eve, Thomas includes a diagram showing the cross-section of the Earth and a description of the process.
The process of a cataclysm is known now. Look at the cross-section of the Earth inside the front cover. You'll see two molten layers, the orange ones. The important one is the thin molten layer starting 60 miles down, extending 60 miles deeper to 120 miles below the surface of the Earth. The thick, deep molten layer starting 1,800 miles down at the bottom of the mantle and extending 1,300 miles deeper is the outer core. Seismology has proven these two orange layers to be molten, and they are white hot, over 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit.
Now, Dr. Thomas was able to predict seismic activity all over the world.
Inside the Earth, the electrical and magnetic structure of the interior makes the layers act as if they were near solid. As long as the magnetic and electrical structure of the Earth maintains its orderliness, it keeps rotating on axis in a normal manner. Every few thousand years, the magnetic and electrical orderliness in the shallow molten layer is disorganized, to the extent that the shallow molten layer is allowed to act as a free liquid, which then serves as a lubricant for the ice caps to pull the shell around the Earth's interior so as to have the ice caps shift about 90 degrees into the torrid zone.
When this event occurs, the layer beneath the Earth's crust turns from solid to liquid. Then the land masses can slide around freely, and the weight of the ice caps then yanks the Earth off axis.
In 1/4 to 1/2 a day, the geographic poles move to the torrid zone, and all hell lets loose.
Well, that's an understatement.
To the torrid. In 1/4 to 1/2 a day, the geographic poles move to the torrid zone, and all hell lets loose.
Well, that's an understatement.
The atmosphere and the Earth's oceans don't shift with the shell. They just keep on rotating west to east, and at the equator, that speed is about 1,037 miles per hour. So while the shell shifts with the poles going to the equator, the winds and oceans continue eastward, blowing and flooding across the Earth at supersonic speeds, inundating continents with water miles deep